But anyway, hello and welcome again to another episode of In Conservation with. I'm David Lindo, as you probably know, and also known as the Urban Birder. And I have a really special and interesting guest, Dave Gandy, who he and I know each other. We'll talk about that in a second. But we also are here tonight, courtesy of the fact that it's been sponsored by Leica Sport Optics. So thank you very much for that sponsorship. I don't know about you, Dave, but I'm sitting here in 36, 37 degrees of heat, and I think it's kind of similar for you where you are now. So, how are you and where are you, Dave?
Thanks, David. I'm fine. I had my COVID jab last night, so I've been a little bit wobbly today, but I'm now feeling totally fine. I'm in Bangkok. It's about, I don't know what temperature is, probably about 34 Celsius or something. It's 10:30 in the evening. The temperature is not going to drop much, but tomorrow it will probably be up to sort of 37, 38 again, as it has been recently. It's meant to be wet season here, but the rains have been a bit irregular so far. So yeah, been a bit hot and sticky.
Yeah, my recollections of Bangkok have been quite interesting. I've always found it to be a very friendly city. People smiling a lot, and the urban birding is phenomenal. And I used to go to Bangkok because I used to have a girlfriend whose family or sister lived in Bangkok with her husband. And I remember one occasion when we went to Hua Hin, which is south of Bangkok, is it?
Yeah, to the south. Yeah, yeah.
And she booked, because we used to go at Christmas, and she booked me into Hua Hin with her. And the next morning she woke up with tonsillitis. And I hated Hua Hin. I found it very kind of, kiss me quick and all that sort of stuff. So I said, love, you stay in bed. I'm going to catch a taxi to a place up the road called Pak Tali. And I'm going to look for a spoonbill sandpiper. I'll see you later one morning, love. So I went off to Pak Tali, had an amazing couple of hours wandering around looking at thousands upon thousands of waders, but not actually seeing the spoonbill sandpiper. So then I came back. The following morning, she was still sick. So again, I went off to Pak Tali. And again, I was unsuccessful, but I did find avocet and black-headed gull. And then I came back, and then on the third morning, in fact, that second evening, I decided, you know what, we can't do this because you're sick. We need to go back to Bangkok. So I rang someone in Bangkok. It wasn't you, actually. It was another guy, Phil Round. And I got him to meet us in the Pak Tali area. And I told my girlfriend that we'd go to Pak Tali, we'll meet with this guy, we'll see the sandpiper, it will take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then he'll give us a lift back to Bangkok. And she said, okay, all right, we'll go with that. So on the third morning, we both went to Pak Tali. I met with Phil Round. We did see the spoonbill sandpiper after 20 minutes, but then I found a black-faced spoonbill, and then he suddenly thought I was his best mate. 14 hours later, we arrived in Bangkok, and I was in the biggest doghouse known to man. I had to renounce any interest or knowledge of birding for 3 days.
Oh dear. But you saw the spoonbill sandpiper, and that's all that matters ultimately, right?
So, Dave, how do we know each other again? I know obviously we met in Bangkok, but did we not meet in UK before then?
Yeah, so I think the first time I met you, I was working for the Devon Wildlife Trust, and you came down. I think you were working at BTO then, and then you came down, and we were talking about membership schemes. I seem to remember it's the first time I met you. That would have been in about like 1996, I would guess. And then after that, I think just seeing you around in Bangkok, obviously, mutual friends we've been catching up with and stuff. I see Sasha's on the call, so I hear a lot about what you're doing through him. When I'm in the UK, I normally go and try to catch up with him and tell him tales about all the rare birds and good stuff he's missing in Bangkok. So yeah, I think that's probably how I know you. And then you came out to Thailand. Well, whenever that was, I don't know how many years ago that was, probably 2012 or something. And then we went both to just around my local patch, Suvarnabhumi, And then also I met up with you in Chiang Mai. We went birding on Doi Sutet, a mountain just outside the city, for a few hours in the morning.
That's right. 'Cause that's
So
where I
yeah,
saw a giant nuthatch and lady
right.
pheasant. No, lady. What's the name of that pheasant?
Mrs. Humes pheasant.
Mrs. H's pheasant. That's one. Yeah, Mrs.
Yeah.
Hughes pheasant. Wow. So I've actually known you a lot longer than I thought because my memory gets a bit blurred after a few weeks even. So it's it's a long time. Now, for those who don't know you, Dave, obviously, how did you kind of get into the whole nature thing?
Well, originally, the way I got into birding originally actually was, I mean, I'd always kind of had a bit of an interest. When I was a kid, we had, do you remember there was that big Reader's Digest book of British birds that had a
Yeah,
big
got it.
tawny owl on the front of
Got
it?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was published in 1972, the same year I was born. And I just always had that book to hand. And then when I was about 6, I think it was, I was watching Blue Peter, as a good English lad does, and they had an article on where they were going to do a YOC big garden bird watch, and so I kind of got my mum to kind of sign me up for that, and then did the bird watch in the garden, and then a few months later, when I've forgotten all about it, I got a letter from the YOC, Young Ornithologists Club, saying, "Do you want to become a member?" I thought, oh yeah, okay, why not? What's ornithologist? That sounds good. So that's how I got into it. And then I then got invited to the local YOC group to go out birding. And they took it to me. I grew up in Surrey, so I met up with them. We went to Epsom Common. This must have been my first YOC magazine. I remember it was June 1979. And it would have been soon after that, I think maybe the following spring, that I first went birding with the group. And I remember being fascinated by the fact that there were these two birds that looked exactly the same but had different sounds. One was a willow warbler and that was chiff-chaff. And so that was kind of like really got me kind of hooked into birding through doing that.
And then you ended up working obviously at the Wildlife Trust. And did you say Devon? I can't remember that.
Yeah, so I was kind of like doing a lot of birding and twitching in the UK through my teenage years, and then went to university. And when I was at university, I did 2 sort of student expeditions to Colombia in South America. Spent both of my summer vacations out there doing bird surveys, and then after that, wanted to get into the conservation, or at least the sort of NGO sector, and got a job working for the Wildlife Trust in Devon. And then moved on from there to a couple of other NGOs, ended up working for BirdLife in the UK for 2 years in Cambridge, and then decided I'm going to up sticks and move to Asia. Wasn't quite how it happened, but that was generally the idea, was that I'd take a one-way ticket to Australia and New Zealand and see what happened, and ended up in Bangkok. I've been here since 2004.
I love that. I love when people have these stories about, I'll just up sticks, got a one-way ticket and see what happens. I mean, that's something that people dream about, but very, very, very few people actually do it. So when you actually did it, were you what was your feeling? Were you really excited? I mean, obviously you were excited, but were you thinking further than 2 weeks ahead, or did you have a kind of a little master plan?
Not really. I knew that I could get, or I'd got actually before I left, a holiday working visa for Australia and for New Zealand, and you can get a year's visa for each, so you can work for 6 months and then travel for 6 months in each country. So I thought I'd do a year in New Zealand and a year in Australia, and then see where it takes me. But actually, what happened was that I got to New Zealand and I couldn't really find any work that I wanted to do. I did some voluntary work for DOC, Department of Conservation. Luckily managed to go and work on Kakapo for a couple of weeks, so got to wander around Codfish Island, which was amazing, as one of their volunteers. And then some friends of mine back in Thailand contacted me, who I'd seen on my way out, and they said, "Oh, we've got some work for you if you're interested." So I ended up coming back to Southeast Asia and doing consultancy work for them. And I didn't really have a plan. I mean, I was excited, but didn't really have a plan. And certainly when I look back on it now, you know, this was 2002. I was pretty poorly genned up in terms of birding. I mean, you know, especially in terms of things like calls and sites and stuff. I mean, you know, we didn't have things like Xenocante back then and eBird and all this kind of stuff. So I was, you know, much more just kind of like go out, find somewhere interesting that looks good and see what I see, rather than being like massively targeted on seeing particular species. So yeah, that's kind of what I did. Yeah, and then since I've been in Asia, yeah, just traveled around the region quite a lot for a couple of years, through work mostly, and fitting in bits of birding where I could, and then decided to settle rather than live out of a suitcase all the time, and so settled in Bangkok, because that seems to be where most of my work was, and it's obviously a very good hub for transport around the region. So that's why I'm here.
Well, I think, you know, your strategy of not, or your unsort of known strategy of not sort of having places to go in terms of birding and just going birding generally, I think that's a good strategy to have anyway, really, because you find things that you never expect, and sometimes it's a bit more exciting than going to a site that you know there's a possibility of seeing something, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always been much more interested in going to a site and staying there for a long time, rather than kind of like, you know, and seeing what I can find there, rather than running from site to site to site to you know, try and stock up as big a list as possible. I mean, when I was in Colombia at the end of our expeditions, we had 3 weeks in a national park that hadn't been surveyed for 20 years or something, and we just stayed there for 3 weeks birding at different altitudes, and it was fantastic. And yeah, I mean, certainly the same thing happens around, you know, in this region now. There are sites in Thailand that have been well known for a long time, which are kind of on the tourist route, if you like, all the bird tours, but constantly there are new sites being found. There's a growing number of young, enthusiastic Thai birders who are going out and looking for stuff and discovering interesting new places all the time. So yeah, I think it's always, you know, the mantra of kind of like birding wherever you are is definitely one that sits well here.
Yeah, and it also works very well when it comes to urban birding, because even in a metropolis like, for example, London, where people think they got it nailed in terms of these are the places to go to, you can still discover some amazing places. I mean, I discovered Wormwood Scrubs. No one was going birding there before I went there.
Really?
And Wormwood Scrubs in West London, and that was getting me, you know, a lot of good birds. And even here in Extremadura, I mean, it's a region in southwest Spain where there's lots of really recognized places, but then I tend to shun those places and try and go to spots that, you know, barely make it anywhere. And I remember even as recently as 2 weeks ago being at some valley. I was basically looking for honey buzzards, and I just found I saw a Bonelli's eagle. Didn't take much notice of it because I obviously looked at it, but I didn't think anything of it because you know, to be found in that region. And when I put it on eBird, I discovered later that it was the first Bonelli's eagle in that particular valley for 25 years. So,
Wow.
you know, you never know what you can discover. So, speaking about discoveries, let's discover what Bangkok is all about, because I'm sure everyone's itching to know, you know, what kind of stuff you can see in such a huge city.
Okay. Here we go.
And Zoomers, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but you could, if you want to see the whole thing properly in terms of Dave's presentation, just put yourself on speaker view and you'll see the whole screen. Okay, Dave, over to you.
Okay, all right, yeah. So I've been living here in Bangkok since 2004. For the first couple of years, I didn't really do any birding in the city whatsoever. My focus was very, very much on thinking, okay, it's a city of 8.5 million people. It's just a concrete jungle. There's nothing to see. You've got to go to the closest sites, which are on the coast, to go and look for spoonbill sandpipers, or you have to go to the national parks. You have Kankachan National Park, which is about a 3-hour drive to the west on the Burmese border, which is the largest national park in Thailand. And then you have Khao Yai National Park, which is 2.5 hours to the northeast, which is the oldest national park. And then there are other national parks, but those are the two kind of most visited by people who are coming to Bangkok. And I always thought that those were the places I had to go to. Then in 2008, Phil Round, I don't know if you can see my screen at all, Phil Round produced this book called Birds of the Bangkok Area. And that really kind of like got me into the idea of thinking I should try and do some birding around the city itself. So, so if you just look at a map of exactly where we're talking about, so you can see where Thailand is situated between with land borders with Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam over to the east, and then to the south we've got Malaysia. And you can see actually the national parks I was just talking about are marked on there. This is Khao Yai over here, and this is Kang Chan down here. So yeah, and then if you look at this other map, you can see that there are the Bight of Bangkok is this area of sea around here, and then there are various sites around the over here to the west is one of the areas we talk about. That's where the airport is. There's a very good site for birding there on rice paddies. A couple of parks in the city that I'll talk about, and then I'll mention a bit about the shorebirds, because they're obviously one of the things that people know an awful lot about if they have any idea about birding in Bangkok.
You might have to click your little arrow on the left-hand side. That's it, yeah.
Oh, that one. Okay, right, fine. Okay, so first of all, I'll talk about the city's parks. So this this large park here, this is Lumpini Park, very, very central, with a couple of, or lots of very big hotels around it. So lots of foreign tourists who come to Bangkok will stay in those hotels if they're interested in birding. Then this is probably the first park that they're likely to come across. And then this other park, which is got the big green expanse in it that you can see, that's Suan Rock 5, which is one of my two local patches. It's used to be an old golf course, but now has been converted into a park. So actually, there are very few occasions in life where you see something being converted from a golf course into something more positive. But fortunately, this park has been one of those that's benefited. But Bangkok doesn't have very many parks at all. It's got these two. So Suan Rock 5 is the biggest by far, and Lumpini is probably the most central. But at the moment, they're in the process of constructing another park. There's been an area of land that's been used to be part of what's called the tobacco monopoly, owned by a government agency that used to be involved in marketing tobacco, and that's now being converted into a large park. I'm not quite sure how good it would be for birding, but I saw some photos of it on Twitter earlier on today, and it seems to have some areas of wetland and so on. So it's got some potential to be really, really impressive. We'll have to wait and see just how good it turns out to be. That's going to be called Benjakitty Park. So getting on to some of the birds that you can see in the park. These are 3 of the 7 species of kingfisher that occur. We've got massive stork-billed kingfisher, which is absolutely huge, and is resident in Thailand. It was actually one of those kind of like keystone birds for me. One of the first birds I saw in the park where I started birding in Suan Rock 5. I'd seen it before in Borneo on the lower Kinabalu River, which is like this massive river through rainforest, and always imagined that was the sort of place that it turned up. So then when I went to Suan Rock 5, this park in Bangkok for the first time, and I saw stork-billed kingfisher, I was really shocked and thought, oh, actually, you know, maybe this city has got something really going for it. And then down here we have ruddy kingfisher, which is quite a rare migrant in Bangkok, but also is quite a difficult bird to see if you're just visiting Thailand as a visitor. It tends to be down in the mangroves, but it's given to seasonal movement. So there's something that I've managed to catch up with in on my local patch a couple of times. And then this little gem in the middle is black-backed dwarf kingfisher. And this is another bird that's a migrant in spring and autumn. Again, quite rare, absolutely tiny. I've managed to see them 3 or 4 times in spring. But I mean, this bird was, one of the best birds I've seen in Thailand. And it's, a very, very close range, just catching fish in front of myself and a bunch of other photographers. Yeah, really exquisite to see. And then one of the other groups that's very well represented in the parks in Bangkok are the flycatchers. So the bread and butter flycatchers that you get both as passage migrants and also in winter are taiga flycatcher, which is this one with the red throat that looks very similar to red-breasted flycatcher. And then Asian brown flycatcher, which is absolutely ubiquitous, throughout Southeast Asia in winter. And then dark-sided flycatcher, which is much less common. It's more a forest bird, but it does turn up on passage in the parks, typically in late spring. It's also all 3 of these have now turned up in the Western Palearctic as well. So it's kind of interesting from a point of view of somebody who's interested in Siberian vagrants to Western Europe. I think dark-sided turned up in Iceland about 4 or 5 years ago. Taiga's obviously turned up in the UK and Asian browns also. And now here we have a group of birds that, well, they haven't really turned up in the UK apart from maybe the first one, depending on your argument. So this is one of the other key migrants that we see in Bangkok, both in spring and autumn. This is yellow rump flycatcher, breeds in southern China. And is often seen through from about the 3rd week of August until late October or mid-October, and then in spring is present from kind of late March through April. And then Mugamaki flycatcher has turned up a couple of times in Europe, once in Italy, and then obviously the record from the UK from the early 90s that was considered to be an escapee. But this is a common migrant in spring, not in autumn at all, actually, a couple of autumn records, but in spring it can be seen pretty easily through sort of late March, early April. And then up here we have greenback flycatcher, which is quite a rarity. See 1 or 2 of those each spring. And then ferruginous flycatcher down here, which is often extremely confiding, as this bird was that I photographed on a patch of greenery just a few 100 meters from my house. And then also quite well represented are the blue flycatchers. So I've only got photos of 2 of them here, but they're an extremely complex group in terms of identification, trying to understand which species is which. They're very, very difficult to identify. These are 2 of the more simple plumerages. So this bird here, which has been taken with a flash, that's a Hainan blue flycatcher. That's quite a widespread wintering bird, and seen on passage in Bangkok. Tends to winter more in forest, but comes through the city on passage. And then this is a bit of a what would we call it, a Lazarus bird, I guess. Something that's very, very little known. It's called large blue flycatcher. It's known to breed in Bhutan and the eastern end of the Himalayas, and it winters in the very south of Thailand, in Phang Nga, close to Phuket, which people may have been on holiday to. In some of the national parks there. But in the last 3 or 4 years, we've realized that there is some local movement through December of this bird coming through Bangkok. So there were 2 or 3 records last December, and then this bird turned up a couple of years before. And actually, David and I saw a bird that people thought may have been a large blue flycatcher, but was determined eventually not to have been. But they're a very, very difficult group. All of the females are brown above with varying amounts of orange below, the calls are all very similar, and they're just an extremely difficult group to get to grips with in terms of identification. It takes an awful lot of practice and time, and I regularly make mistakes with them still. And then another group that has been is well represented on Passage, and also it's been a bit of a challenge really over the last 4 or 5 years to understand, is the paradise flycatchers. So Asian paradise flycatcher was regarded as a single species up until about 5 years ago, and then it was split by the IOC and Clements, I think, into 2 different species, or 3 species, which are Blythe's paradise flycatcher, which is this one. As you can see, it's got a grey throat compared with this bird here, and that's one of the main features for separating it. This is a bird that's very common throughout Thailand in forest, but in winter it tends to move into the parks, and so we see it on Passage, and particularly in autumn. And this bird actually was wintering in February in Suan Fly, my local patch. And then this bird is Amur paradise flycatcher, so it has it breeds further north. It migrates to China to breed, and then winters, I think, in southern Thailand, and again it comes through Bangkok on Passage. You can see it's got this nice glossy black throat, which is one of the key features for separating it from Blythe's. And then another species that's rare all the way through Thailand actually is Japanese paradise flycatcher. So this is a very, very scarce migrant, which has only been, I think this one that I saw was the only one that's been recorded in Bangkok. It's recorded regularly on Koh Manai, which is a small island on the eastern side of the Gulf of Thailand, where Phil Round and his team have been doing a lot of bird rigging over the last 2 years. It's really kind of built up reputations, the kind of Fair Isle of Thailand in terms of numbers of migrants passing through there on Passage. So that taxonomic change has really kind of made me have to look much more carefully at every paradise flycatcher that I see. I see a few each autumn, I guess probably between 3 and 5 birds if I'm lucky. And then we get into the nitty gritty of the warblers. That's one of the other very well represented groups in Suan Phi and in the city generally in green spaces. So this is Arctic warbler, which has now been split into 3 species: Arctic, Kamchatka, and Japanese. Japanese is very, very rare, and in Thailand it's only been recorded a few times in spring. Kamchatka is also mostly seen in spring, but with a few autumn records. And the majority of the birds that we see are Nominate borealis Arctic warbler, which is the same that occurs in Western Europe. This bird here has been another conundrum for a number of years. So this would have been regarded as pale-legged leaf warbler up until about 5 years ago. But then that was split. There was a split made between pale-legged leaf warbler and satin leaf warbler. They're virtually indistinguishable on plumage, but their song is very different from one another, and they breed in different places in Northern Asia, and so they've been split on the basis of that vocalization and some differences in terms of their biology. But I kept hearing 2 different calls being uttered by birds that I always considered to be pale-legged leaf warblers. And I contacted Phil Round, who's kind of like the regional expert, and he said, oh well, there's been some work done by a Japanese guy who said that he can't distinguish them even in the hand, and so it's really, really impossible to do. And I said, well, look, I've been hearing these 2 different calls, and it doesn't seem to be beyond the bounds of possibility that they are actually, both species are represented in Bangkok. And then lo and behold, at some stage a bit later on, some birders in Singapore found the first Sakhalin leaf warbler. I think what happened was that the bird was wintering there, and then it started singing. And so they were then, because they knew that the call, it had been giving a call, a contact call, which is what it normally does on the wintering grounds, and they were able to do some work that then established how different the call is, the contact call between sackling and pale-legged, and that's when I realised that both birds are present in my local patch. We've now established that sackling is the one that winters, and pale-legged tends to be much more of a passage migrant. And then the next bird that we've got down here is Eastern Crown Warbler, which has now been recorded in Western Europe a handful of times. But here in Bangkok, it's very, very common. It's an autumn migrant particularly. Starts to turn up in late August and can be found pretty regularly through until early November. But a very, very striking bird. You can see, lots and lots of bright green in the wing. It's got a very, very nice coronal stripe up here. It's one of my favourite birds actually that I see on a regular basis. And then we've got a couple of others, which are again another split. This is Claudia's leaf warbler, which is quite uncommon as a winter or late autumn passage migrant through November, December, and that used to be part of the Glide's leaf warbler group, which was then split, and that led to another species here. This is Heart-Earth leaf warbler, which winters actually normally around Hong Kong, but one was found on my local patch and constituted the first record for Thailand. That's in about 2015. A couple of other rare warblers that I've managed to find. This really kind of tells you a bit about, just going to a patch that nobody goes to and just watching it regularly and seeing what you can find. So about 600 meters from my house where I am right now talking to you, there's a small government compound which has got a running track around it, like a walking track, which is surrounded by big trees. And I always thought, well, I'm not going to see any birds there, but I'll start walking there to keep fit and just to have a bit of greenery before I have to go to work each day. And I started to see a few bits and pieces. And so then I decided I'd start watching it more regularly. And then in the last couple of years, more due to kind of like family commitments, and then as a result of the pandemic and having to kind of lock down and just, visit a local area, I started birding it much more seriously. And managed to find these two birds. So this is Bianchi's warbler, which is only really known to winter in the north of Thailand. So this is about 800 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers south of where it should have been. And this is Chinese leaf warbler, which was only it's the first record for the central plains of Thailand. This just goes to show that you can really find anything anywhere if you can keep watching one site consistently. The site list now is about 110 or 115 species. I think it's, if I combine that with the birds I've seen flying over from my house, because it's so close I can see it, I think the list is up to about 145. So it's really quite remarkable that you can see lots of birds in an absolute tiny area of habitat. And then a couple of another group that can often be well represented at the right time of year in Bangkok is the thrushes. So I've seen eyebrow thrush quite regularly, had them even whilst doing Vizmig over my house. And then these two are, this is white-throated rock thrush, which is a rare but regular migrant in late autumn or mid-autumn, sort of October, November. And then orange-headed ground thrush, which again is probably equally common as a migrant in winter. And that's something, if I'm birding every day, I might run into sort of 3 or 4 of each of these each year. And then two birds that will obviously be close to the hearts of many European birders, both of which I've seen on my local patch, which kind of makes it feel like paradise, is Siberian ruby throat. I've only seen them there once. There were 3 birds, I think, wintering there one year in about 2013. And Siberian blue robin is a regular scarce migrant that can be seen every autumn and most springs. And then I think this is the last slide regarding my local patches in the city, but the city parks do also occasionally turn up pitters. Yeah, kind of a dream come true really for a birder from the UK to move to a city where it's possible to have pitters in your local patch. So obviously we were 3 species here. This is blue-winged, which is very common and widespread throughout Thailand when the wet season starts. We've heard calling from many different patches of habitat. Hooded pitter, which is perhaps a bit less common, more forest dependent. And it's a migrant that we often see in May and particularly in autumn in like November. And then fairy pitter, which I have not yet seen in Bangkok, but has occurred a few times. It was only first reported in Thailand in 2009, I think it was, but has now been recognised as being quite a regular scarce migrant. And then just a couple of slides about Vizmig from my house. So visible migration watching. I know something that David pioneered in London actually through his work at Tower 42, I think it was called. And yeah, I started trying a couple of autumns ago to see what I can see flying over. I was kind of thinking, well, I spend all this time kind of looking in bushes and trees and whatever in various parks in Bangkok, but I wonder if there's other stuff that's flying over that people just don't see. And so started doing some visible migration watching during autumn from my balcony, and wasn't really that great. But then I got a couple of birds that really kind of blew my mind in terms of seeing them in the city. The first of which was a flock of 33 glossy ibis, which which wasn't really what I was expecting to see flying over at altitude, you know, in the middle of the city. And that actually constituted the first record for Bangkok, much to my shock. But I've managed to find a few other species from home as well, including oriental honey buzzard I've had for the last 2 autumns. Dorian starling is something that's recorded on a regular basis, but is often, it's recorded occasionally in the city, normally when birds are found, flocks of birds are found in fruiting trees. But I established last autumn that it's actually quite regular just from seeing them fly over my house. And then the last 2 autumns, I've had some waders go over, so I've seen black-tailed godwit a couple of times. And then last autumn, I saw a Pacific golden plover fly over 2 or 5 minutes after seeing a pair of Pacific swifts fly over, and that was one of the highlights of my Vizmig career from my house. And then, as you may know, one of the other big things about autumn birding in Thailand, it's been established that there's now a huge number of migrant raptors that pass down the peninsula of Thailand, the Isthmus of Kra. There are a couple of sites that people watch where you can see 30, 40,000 species, individuals of a single species in one day. This is black bazza. Numbers of black bazza get up to about 70,000 on a couple of dates in late October. And I've managed to see this species from my house a couple of times as well on passage when there are big numbers heading over or down through the country. So change of habitat now to talk a little bit about rice paddies. So obviously the central plains of Thailand were kind of known as the rice bowl of Asia for a long time. So the city is surrounded by rice paddies. There's one particular site called Lac Prabang rice paddies that's become quite popular with Bangkok birders over the last 2 years. It's got about 180 species that have been recorded there. And some of those I've just represented here to give you an idea of the diversity. So red-throated pipit is quite common in midwinter. I had a flock there of about 80 birds last year. There's also other pipits as well. Richard's pipit, Paddyfield pipit, and yeah, I think those are the owners. And also eastern yellow wagtail is very, very common in the same habitat. And then Oriental Pratt-and-Cole is actually a summer visitor here. So there are a few birds, a few species that fly to Bangkok in the hot, wet season to breed. One of those is Oriental Pratt-and-Cole. And there's probably about 100 or so pairs, maybe more, that breed out at Lac Krabang and allow very close views. A couple of other wintering species. Yeah, I won't apologise for having a second photograph of a ruby throat in there, but Siberian ruby throat winters in small numbers there, and blue throat seems to be relatively common. In winter, you can go and see 2 to 3 birds in different locations on any one trip. And then this was the big surprise, or that I was very, very happy to find there last winter. About 2 winters ago, somebody reported yellow-breasted bunting there. Yellow-breasted bunting is now critically endangered on the BirdLife list, or the IUCN Red List, and so it's very, very low density in most areas. So I was very, very happy to run into a group of 2 or 3 birds, possibly up to 8 birds actually last, or in the earlier part of this spring. And then going a little bit further away from the city, the Saltpans. So if you drive, so Lac Krabang, the area with the rice paddies, is about half an hour's drive from my house. And then if you drive an hour in the opposite direction, you come to the Saltpans and the coast of Thailand, and the Gulf of Thailand. We have a few key species which I've just introduced here, one of which is great knot. Very big numbers of great knot wintering in this area now. I think some birds have moved in from other more traditional wintering sites over the last few years, I think, in terms of changes to habitat and some of the Saltpans being better suited to them. So it's possible to now go and see flocks perhaps of 800 or so in midwinter, which is very nice. And then and actually, great knot is I think it's listed as endangered on the IUCN red list. And then 3 other species that we're lucky enough to have. Spoon-billed sandpiper is obviously the flagship really of the Saltpans and the inner Gulf of Thailand. This is Green 05, which sadly this year didn't reappear, but she's a female that had been returning to Thailand for about 5 or 6 years, and I think had been recorded on breeding grounds around Mica Pilgana in the Russian Far East as well. And so her history was quite well studied, and she'd also been sighted, I think, at a staging site in China as well on a couple of occasions. Kokam, the site that has these close to Bangkok, has in the last few years had maybe 1 or 2 birds wintering. Pak Tale that David spoke about earlier has had perhaps up to 5 birds wintering in recent years. That's a bit further away. I haven't really talked about that site here. It's about probably a 2 to 2.5 hour drive from Bangkok. Another bird that's very well represented on the inner Gulf of Thailand, close to Bangkok, is Asian dowitcher. You can often see flocks, perhaps between 1 and 200 or in many months actually, through, I think I've seen them in August and then through to May. In a few years we've coordinated counts with people recording perhaps 400 or 500 birds at any one time. And then Norderman's green shank, another endangered species, which is very rare and tends to be down more towards Pak Tale, but often gets to be seen here as well, sometimes seen in the Gulf. And then perhaps surprisingly, one other thing that you can do in Bangkok is go whale watching. So we have Eden's whale here, which is the smaller counterpart of Bruder's whale. There's a population in the inner Gulf of around, I think, between 60 and 80 individuals. And they have this amazing way of feeding where they basically, the water's so shallow that they can effectively sit with their tail on the seabed and point their whole body upwards and just open their mouths when they find a school of fish, and just open their mouths, and the fish just jump in. And I mean, this photo was taken, I think, in summer last year when there weren't many birds around, but in the winter, you know, get huge numbers of terns and stuff flying around these birds, flying around these whales. This is the boat we normally go out on. And not only is it good for whales, but also can be interesting for seabirds. I wouldn't say the inner Gulf of Thailand is good for seabirds because it's very, very slow and hard work, and the numbers are very small. But I've been lucky enough to encounter both wedge-tailed shearwater, which is this one here, and also short-tailed shearwater, both in May and various years. These birds are probably been blown up by southerly winds, and then they've got themselves stuck in the Gulf, which is, so they're surrounded on three sides by land, and they just perhaps stick around to molt or try and figure their own way out of the Gulf. But they're very, very rare, and very few Thai birders have encountered them. But there's a good chance of running into them. And then frigate birds, Christmas Island frigate bird, which is critically threatened and quite hard to catch up with, is occasionally seen in the Gulf close to Bangkok. And then this is a lesser frigate bird being mobbed by a bridal tern. Probably appears about as often. So they're both around, but hard to catch up with. And then terns, bridal tern up here is a regular bird, particularly in the wet season. You see it around about now, June, July, August. And much rarer is sooty tern down here. Typically, they tend to be immature birds that are in molt. And then last year, for the first time, we discovered Aleutian terns were wintering or actually, these are first summer birds that were over summering in the Gulf of Thailand. So they've been known from winter around Singapore and the Malacca Strait for a long time, but nobody really knew if there were birds in Thailand, and then we discovered last year by some of the enthusiastic young Thai birders going out on trips. Okay, and so this is my last slide, just to say thank you. And this gives you an idea of exactly what the situation is for seeing whales in proximity to Bangkok. So this is an Eden's whale surrounded by a flock of terns. And then over here in the distance, these are some of the high-rise buildings in Bangkok. This is the tallest building in Bangkok, the Ritz-Carlton Residency. And then this is the State Tower, which is a regular haunt for tourists to go and visit. It has a very nice rooftop bar. So if you're in Bangkok, I recommend you both go whale watching and you go to the rooftop bar. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dave. I mean, that to me is glory urban birding, and you are the accidental urban birder there in Bangkok. Firstly, how many species have they been seen within the city limits? Do you know?
So I looked on eBird, and I think it's about 340, maybe something like that. I've seen 250 something. Yeah, and I don't think many people try and see lots of birds in the city, but I kind of, because I'm trying to do lots of stuff locally. It's one of those things I've taken a bit more of an interest in. I mean, most people kind of are happy to drive out to Camp Chan or to Khao Yai or whatever and go birding, but kind of both in terms of my lifestyle and also in terms of wanting to kind of be low carbon, I've kind of been trying to do local stuff as much as possible. And also I think it's an untapped resource. I think there's lots of surprises to be found. So yeah, I think there's about 320 in total that we've seen in the city.
Yeah, Dave, you are a man after my own heart. What is left for you in terms of birds in Bangkok? What do you dream about when you walk around your local patch?
You mean to find?
Yes.
Oh, a lot of the things that I really, really wanted to find, I have found now. So, or at least seen. So large blue flycatcher was one of the things I really wanted to see, just because it's so poorly known. I think really, to be honest, it's not really, it's wanting to see something that's completely unexpected. So the Bianchi's warbler and the Chinese leaf warbler that I showed on the slides, both of those were completely unexpected. I mean, there's another warbler that looks very much like the Bianchi's, which is regular. It's called an Ahlstrom's warbler, named after Per Ahlstrom.
He's been a guest on this, by the way.
Right, yeah, and the received wisdom was that all of the birds that passed through Bangkok that looked like this kind of group of what were once called golden spectacled warblers were all Ahlstrom's warbler. And I thought, and this one turned up on my patch, and I'd seen several supposed Ahlstroms before, and I'd never bothered to kind of investigate any further about like recording the vocalizations or anything. And I did with this one. I thought, oh, I need to start recording them and just listen to see exactly what it is, make sure it is Ahlstrom's. And then got the sound recording and played it and compared it with other things and was like, oh my goodness, this is Bianchi's. This is not, it's not what people thought. So now, really it just goes to show that you've got to be really, really on your toes in terms of identification and checking that everything really is what's accepted and not to accept received wisdom. And then the Chinese leaf warbler was another shock because it looks like Pallas's warbler, right? It's got a bright yellow rump. There are no philosks, no warblers that should have a bright yellow rump in Bangkok. And so I saw that bird, and I thought it was something that had some feathers displaced, so it's just showing white. And then I got my binoculars on it and suddenly realized, oh, looks like a yellow-brown warbler, but it's actually got like a yellow rump. What's going on here? So, and I just thought, I don't know what this is, because whatever it is, it's well out of range. So things like that, just, there's always just the unexpected to be had. And I think that's the thing that I find really, really interesting about it. Yeah.
So it looks like I'm going to have to strike off the Pallas's warbler I saw in Thailand then, because I can't be sure it was one.
Well, no, I mean, Paddies is here as well, so you can identify them. But I mean, that Chinese leaf warbler was clambering around in grass. So I think actually in terms of just its habitat and what it was doing, it's quite different from Pallas's. And Pallas's is actually much brighter on the head. The yellow is much stronger. So they are different, and the call is different again. But yeah, it's when you come and live in Asia and you're spending lots of time looking at philosks, you really realize that you've got to be very, very on the ball with your ID skills, because they're tough.
So what's it like for a beginner birder in Bangkok then? I mean, two questions. What's it like for a beginner birder starting out in Bangkok? And the second thing is, what do people living in Bangkok who aren't birders think about birders? Is there an outreach? Do people kind of take it on board, or are you viewed upon as oddities?
So in terms of what it's like as a beginner birder, I think it's good. Basically because there's lots of large, brightly coloured stuff. I mean, the first slide I showed was of kingfishers. And so, there are kingfishers. You can regularly see blue-tailed bee-eater. There's Indian roller. There are lots of big, colourful, charismatic, easy to identify birds here. So it's quite a good place to get started, because you can see things that are going to keep you enthused. There's also a growing number of Thais who are interested in birding. So to kind of go to your second question, I think generally there's an interest in nature and the natural world. And certainly, I mean, I can see in the time that I've lived here, a real change in consciousness towards the environment. It's probably behind the curve with Western Europe, but it's definitely changed a lot. I mean, it used to be the case that, just things like you walk into the local convenience store and buy a bottle of milk, and you would be given a plastic bag automatically, and then also a straw, as if you're going to walk down the street drinking your pint of milk. And you were given a straw all the time for everything. You couldn't walk out of a convenience store without carrying a straw. So I think there's a greater environmental awareness now, and that's that's growing all the time. And there is also a growing number of birders. So the BirdLife partner has been doing a lot of outreach. They do bird walks in most of the parks every month, and so people can go along and join. So yeah, it's actually quite a good place to start birding, and doing quite a lot to engage people.
Good. Okay, well, we've come to that point in the evening, afternoon, morning, where I ask you two very important questions. The first of which is, what, if you can say, is your favorite bird?
It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think it has to be spoonbill sandpiper. I mean, I've got a thing for waders anyway, just because I find their physiology completely incredible, because they can survive in such extreme habitats, you know, in salt water and saline habitats, and they've got these amazing migrations. You know, there was a spoonbill sandpiper that was tracked migrating, and it flew over mainland Southeast Asia. It flew over Laos. Laos landlocked and doesn't have spoonbill sandpiper on the country list, but one's recorded from a satellite tag flying over the country. And yeah, the migration distances they do, and because of course it's, you know, become this flagship for the birds of the eastern flyway. I think it's, and also we have them wintering close to Bangkok. And every time you go, even if you're not specifically looking for spoonbill sandpiper, in your head you're looking for spoonbill sandpiper, because you know they're there, and they're just, yeah, there's something very, very special about them.
Yeah, I'd say
that's my favorite bird.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to see them twice in my life now, so I can die a happy man. And if you could be anywhere in the world, notwithstanding the current pandemic and the fact that you are trying to be carbon neutral, where would you be?
So I've got a friend. It's June now, isn't it? Going to, yeah, June. So I've got a friend that has been leading tours for the last 7 or 8 years, maybe longer, to the Russian Far East. And he says that it's one of the best places. It's his favorite tour that he leads, because the wildlife is just amazing. And you get to see all the Pacific auks, and you get to see lots of bears and all this kind of stuff. And also, related to my previous answer, that their tour encompasses Margapilgana, which is the area where spoonbill sandpiper breeds. And I think seeing spoonbill sandpiper on its breeding grounds, having seen it so many times here on its wintering grounds, would be a very, very special thing to do in what's supposedly a very beautiful part of the world.
Sounds amazing. Zoomers, just to let you know that on Monday we've got Tessa Bose, Monday the 14th of June, speaking about Etta Lemon, the woman, or in fact one of the women that formed the RSPB, who hasn't been celebrated until now. And even now they have to fundraise for a statue, which I think is incredible. And then on Thursday the 17th, we've got Paul McGuinness, who's the editor of BBC Wildlife magazine, and he's going to be talking about how the most famous wildlife magazine in the world is put together. And to end the series on Monday the 28th, we've got Joe Shute, who is a journalist, and he's written a book about the weather, and he's going to be asking the question, what do you know about the weather? Okay, so Dave, it's been really great to have you here. I'm glad that you've made it despite your pseudo COVID symptoms.
I forgot all about them now.
Really great to have you here to enlighten us about the bird life in Bangkok and environs. I love the area when I went there. I'm looking forward to coming back one day as well, hanging out and doing a bit of birding with you.
Yeah, it'd be great. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, David.
Thank you. And Zoomers, once again, thank you for sparing your afternoon on a day of a partial eclipse for some people to sit here and watch Dave and I talk about birds, and in particular birds of Bangkok. So thank you again. Look forward to seeing you on a future in conservation with. and you know what to do. Take care of yourselves. And like Dave has started doing on his rooftops, keep looking up.